Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by my usual gang, Cody Thompson. How you doing, Cody?
Fantastic.
Tracy, are you fantastic?
I'm all right today. Not fantastic, just all right.
Yeah, I love that honest answer. We're going to talk about that in a second. How about you, Matt? Thumbs up, thumbs down in the middle? He's doing good. Okay. I also have Karen here helping me out. You never know when Karen's going to grab that microphone from me and say, I got something to say. Actually, she would never do that, but I might make her. But we're going to talk, before we get into the podcast topic today, we're going to talk about Tracy. Because one thing, we were planning this podcast, and she was like, yeah, I really don't like days when we do the podcast. And I said, why? She goes, I love talking about them. I love organizing them. She's a D and an E, but I don't love being on them because I feel like I have to say the right thing. And I'm not an I, and I'm not disruptive, and it's really tough for me to jump in. And so the pressure is on. And I said, oh, that is crazy. I said, well, your role should be, because you're our producer and our adult supervision, your role should be to make sure we're on track and to just pull us back and ask the questions that guide us back. And she goes, well, I would love that role. But people would probably not know, why isn't she saying something really smart right now? Which Tracy does all the time. But when she has to perform, she feels pressure.
I love it. You're outing me, Pat. You're outing me. I didn't realize you were going to do that.
Yeah, I decided 15 minutes ago that we had to talk about this because we use Working Genius in everything we do.
Yes.
So being on a podcast is not your favorite thing.
No.
But helping us make it great is.
That is my favorite thing. Podcast prepping is my favorite job. I love, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I actually have to talk. And that stresses me out. So it distracts me a little bit.
And you know what happens? And this happens to a lot of people around Working Genius is we almost don't think you're telling the truth. Because you obviously do a great job. You seem very comfortable and you say really smart things. And she says, yeah, I hate having to do that. And we're like, oh yeah, you're just saying that. And it's so important that we realize when a person's not working in their genius, even if somehow they manage to do it, it's at a cost. And when we finally believe that they're telling us the truth, we have to do our best to accommodate them in some way. So what we're going to do, Tracy, is your job is to keep us on track, ask us questions if you think we need to, but that's what's expected of you.
Thank you. I so appreciate that. I think I'll enjoy it more.
Great. Wonderful. Okay, so we got that out of the way. Cody, what's the title of today's episode?
6 for 6.
That's right, 6 for 6. And here's what we mean. When a team, a group of people is involved in any project or endeavor or program, all 6 of the geniuses are required and necessary. All of them are. And when even one is missing and not brought to bear, there are very specific problems and challenges that arise. And that's what we want to talk about today is what happens when even one of the working genius is not present or brought to bear in an activity.
I love this conversation, Pat. And I think it's important that what you said up front is that it's that these 6 activities are what are required for any project or task. So think of that as sort of like the format. And then we need people that represent those activities as a part of that required task. And so because those 6 things are required, if one of them is missing, it can have a dramatic impact on the success of that endeavor, whether it's, planning a vacation or launching a new product. And what I love is what we're going to get into is this is where it's so fun when you learn Working Genius and we live in it and swim in it. You can walk into a room and see a team that is underrepresented in one of the 6 types of Working Genius or multiple. And it almost feels like you're a magician sometimes. Like when you say, hey, you guys are low in invention, and we'll talk about what that means. And it almost is like you're reading their mail or you've been to their meetings for a month because it definitely accurately predicts where projects fall off or people get lost or stuck or bored.
Exactly. Because, and that's the beauty of this. It's just naturally true that all of these things are needed. And when one's missing, you just can't fake it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're going to talk. So let's talk about the first one. What happens when a team does not have wonder? Now, I like starting here because this is one of the geniuses, maybe the genius that people who have it don't really believe that it's necessary, because for so long in their lives, wanderers are told, why are you asking questions? Why are you not bought in? Why are you still thinking about this? But as it turns out, Every organization, every project, everything that gets done requires somebody to say, wait a second, I have a question. I'm curious about this. Is this really the best we can do? Should we be rethinking this? And so I worked with an executive team of a technology company that I don't know if it was 10 to 15 billion dollars in annual revenue, huge company. But they self-admittedly had been behind the market in technology for years. But they had good legacy products and an installed customer base. And they were always lamenting the fact that, like, we are just so behind in the market. We got to be more innovative and we got to figure this out. So we looked at their working genius, and literally 10 minutes after looking at their team map, not only did we learn that nobody on the team had W, but I think like 8 of the 10 people had W as their working frustration. So they really didn't like it. And I remember the CFO, which in this case stands for the Chief Friggin' Officer, because he was like, whoa, wait a second. He goes, no wonder we're so far behind. None of us W, none of us wonder. Nobody ever says, maybe our customers don't like what we have, or maybe the market's changed, or maybe we need to rethink where we're headed. All of their meetings were decidedly not wondering. They had near-term goals and tactics and items they had to cross off a list and a Gantt chart they needed to fill in. And he said, and it was the CFO who didn't like wondering either, but he said, this is our problem. We either need to hire somebody on our team or structure time where we force ourselves to sit and reflect on what is going on around us. And it blew me away that they actually restructured their team and the way they did their business in order to bring wonder onto their team.
Yeah, I love that story, Pat, because when you think about it, I agree with you. There's a lot of people out there with the gift of wonder, and they're like, well, how valuable is this really in the context of these 6 other gifts? And it is critical, because without wonder, I like talking about it with the connection to the next genius, which is, if you don't have wonder on a team, you're sort of inventing for invention's sake, and it's not actually solving a problem. And I think there was a listener of this podcast who wrote in and who has wonder, and he was like, you guys often talk about wonder as sort of the person who asks questions, and it's in search of identifying the right problem to solve. And so there is this really important, like, we have to start with the right question in order to invent to something. And so these guys, it's not like they hadn't come out with new products necessarily. They probably did, this technology team. The thing is they probably were coming out with new products that didn't match what was going on in the market or the needs of their customers. So they didn't start with the right question, and they were inventing to the wrong answer. You know what I mean?
Exactly. This whole working genius came about because Amy said to me, why are you like that?
Mm-hmm.
What is going on with you? How come you get frustrated sometimes, and how come you're not sometimes? And what's the deal with that? She didn't know the answer. And that got me to thinking, I need to figure this out. And that put my eye into full mode. But I have to say, the same team we're talking about, what was also interesting, Cody, is that they only had one guy in their team that had invention. Because see, it's a huge company. So they think, well, we have inventors deeper in the organization inventing technology. But nobody on the executive team had it. But you need it at that level too. The only person on their team who had invention as a genius was their lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
Their lawyer. And they did this, and I wasn't telling them this stuff. They were coming to these conclusions on their own. They said, we need to change your job to the lawyer. We're going to put you in charge of, because you're naturally interested in this, we know. We're going to put you in charge of new technology acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, I would love doing that. And I checked on this company. It's been a couple of years. He is now doing that full time. He's not even their chief legal counsel anymore. So they found a guy who spent 3 years in law school and all these years doing law. And they said, you're the best inventor we have. We're going to actually make that your job. This company is a totally different company because they realized they didn't have W, and they needed that guy that had invention to do that job. And this was in like 15 or 20 minutes after they saw their results without the guidance of me. I didn't have to pretend like I was a magician. They saw the writing on the wall and they made the decisions themselves.
Yeah, that story almost sounds like we made it up, but I love that you use that one because it really emphasizes 2 things. And one thing we've talked about on this podcast is it sort of deconstructs the silos of job titles. It's sort of like, hey, I get it. You're a lawyer and you went to school for law, but one of the things that you bring to the table is this level of invention that we desperately need at this on this team. And so it's sort of like and what a gift to him. I mean, the idea that he gets to, there was probably not a lot of revolutionizing or inventing things in his department because they're settling cases. And so he gets to exercise this part of his how he's wired that gives him joy and energy in a completely new way, just because they were able to identify, one, that this was necessary at every level of the organization, but two, that there was someone on their team that they could tap into.
Right. So and remember W and I, Cody, that's the ideation phase.
Yep.
And this company had virtually no ideation going on in their organization at the top.
Yep.
At the top. And so they address that structurally and by changing a guy's job, which is fantastic. Do you have a good question for us, Tracy? I see you writing things down over there.
And I think this is a little too premature, but chances are teams are actually going to be missing a genius. What is the solution? What is your suggestion for teams missing a genius?
That's not premature at all. In fact, that's the big thing. People go, "Oh, okay, so should we look at our team map and say you're the one that does this?" That's not realistic, right? Mm-hmm. Let me tell you another story. We didn't prep this, but that shows you what a team does. So there was another team that was the sales department within a company, and the head of the sales department was awesome. This woman who had been hired to restart jump sales, and in the first few years that she was there, she did that. She made her numbers. She was great. She built a great department. The customers loved her. They got things done. So she had done a fabulous job. Then the market changes, as it always does, and they had to come up with a brand new strategy for how to go to market and do sales. So the CEO says to this woman, "So that's up to you. You're the head of sales. Come up with a new strategy and let us know." And she really struggled, and she didn't know why. And the CEO actually was thinking about, maybe I have to let her go. Maybe this is her Achilles heel. And so they did Working Genius. And again, I'm not making this up, I promise. And nobody on her team had invention. They're in sales, but they cranked. They got things done. They pleased customers. And so they found this guy in marketing. And yes, sales and marketing people do work together sometimes. And they said to him, "Will you help us with this?" And in 4 hours, they borrowed his eye. They brought him in, and for 4 hours, he worked with them, and they completely redid their sales strategy. They just needed a day to do that. And then they could go implement it. So they said, you're our hero. You're going to be our borrowed eye. We're going to borrow you when we need to invent something new or rethink things in a creative way. And the CEO said, "I was going to let go this woman who had a great cultural fit at our company and got her job done so well just because she didn't have eye in her team or in herself." And so you don't have to hire somebody. Sometimes you go to find somebody else in the organization, you make their day, and you let them do what they love doing. And so it's not a one way to do it. There's lots of different ways to do this. Sometimes you have an outside person, a consultant. Sometimes you just borrow somebody. Sometimes you find the people in your organization that have it as a working competency, and you ask them to help you do it for a day. But as Cody likes to say, but don't make them do it all the time.
Yeah, actually, I love this question. I ordered what I thought were here are the four. If you're missing a genius, here's the order in which you should actually approach that conversation. And I do think the first part is, if you're in the case like the story you told of Wonder, Pat. The first thing is, when you look at your team map, you might just adjust someone's role. So in that case, it was like they had the genius on the team, but they weren't putting that person in the right role in order to exercise that genius. So one, look at the team map, adjust roles. Two would be find someone else in the organization, borrow laterally, or even borrow someone deeper in the organization if possible, because someone that has that as a genius. And the question we always get is like, so what, hiring, where does that fall? And hiring probably falls third because it's a little harder, takes a little bit more time. You want to make sure they're a cultural fit. And on top of that they have the genius you need. So if you can't borrow, or if you can't adjust roles and you can't borrow, I'd look to hire. And I even put that one above the last one, which is rely on somebody's competency. And I say that because we have seen and Tracy is here and we'll talk about her, but we've seen it's so natural to say, you're pretty good at that, why don't you do it? And then it turns into what looks like a Band-Aid for a day. And because they're decent at it, they do it for a long time and they get all the way to burnout. And this is the way you discovered this model, Pat. You were a decent galvanizer. And Trace, but that's a competency of yours. And for years, over that time, we relied on you to do that, and it burned you out. And Tracy, you have tenacity as a competency, and we basically told you you're going to do most of the tenacity around here. So I think that's the most dangerous one, actually, is to use someone's competency.
Yep. I agree. It's so interesting. So you lack ideation. Now let's move into the middle two, which is, what about when you're missing discernment, which is part of activation? And we talked to a company, a famous company that makes athletic apparel and everything. And they were doing what so many companies do, and they didn't have discernment and galvanizing going on. They were inventing new products and then throwing them to the people to implement them, doing enablement and tenacity. And nobody was happy because the people that were getting them were saying, why don't you guys vet these products better? And the people that were sending them were like, why don't you guys implement these things better? And they realized when you're not discerning and then galvanizing, the ideation doesn't connect to the implementation.
Right.
And so let's talk about discernment. Now, I wish I had more stories. I think the reason why we don't have better stories about teams that are missing discernment is because what they're missing is really hard to notice in some sort of like tactical, observable way. Because discernment is one of those internal processes, and it requires instinct and judgment. And you just don't walk into a room and go, hey, there's no instinct and judgment here.
Right.
And yet there are things that we can see. What were you going to say, Cody?
Well, you're totally right. It's hard to capture in a single story. Like, what does that do? You can actually do some forensic analysis on the back end of when a team is missing it. And I think what that is it tends to be that you do more, less good ideas. So discernment is about like fewer, better things, not more. And so like on a team, for example, if a team lacks discernment, the fallout of that eventually is pointing fingers and blame, like you mentioned, like, oh, the inventors are actually inventing bad products, or the implementers aren't doing it right. So there's confusion and blame about whose fault it is. And when really all it was is we just didn't stop to evaluate the ideas and refine the ideas. The first part of activation, that discernment phase, is, boy, we have 5 ideas, and which one should we do? And when you have discernment represented, it probably means that you go to market with 2 of those that are more refined. And if you don't, you do all 5 of them and only one of them works halfway.
You know, that's a good point. If you're 2 for 10 on your products, like, oh, about out of every 10 ideas that we tried, 2 of them work, it is probably a discernment issue.
Yep.
And it's not that, hey, your inventors aren't very smart. No, inventors throw things against the wall. Discerners are the ones that look at it and say, which of these is going to stick? So probably a low percentage of hit rates with new ideas is a decent sign that discernment is not there. Now, the story I like to tell, Cody and Tracy and Karen and Matt and all of our listeners, the story I like to tell is there was a team, this is very retroactive or looking back, that couldn't figure out why they were losing money. And they were just hemorrhaging cash. And they were all looking at their data and they just couldn't figure it out. And they were doing it in a very linear, quantitative way. And then they did Working Genius and they said, we don't have any D on our team. And there was a woman a little deeper in the organization. They said, hey, bring her to our meetings because we really like her. And like in 2 weeks, she was like, I think your problem is here. I'm not sure, but it feels to me like this is probably the problem. And they said, well, let's look into that. And she was right. And they saved like $500,000 in 2 weeks, which I'm not making up. That's what they told us. They couldn't figure, it was like she just could see like the patterns of what was going on and kind of connect the dots. And her instinct said, I think it must be here. Now, if a scientist said, prove it to me, they would have been like, I don't know how to do that. But they just trusted her gut. They went there, and that's where the opportunity was.
Right.
So people with discernment, it's really difficult for a scientist to go back and explain how they got to that point. But they usually have some pretty good instincts.
Well, and I bet when people listen to that, they're like, well, you probably didn't tell the other part of the story where she was like she was really good at finances or bookkeeping, and she found that's not it. It had nothing to do with the fact that she went in and looked at their books and said, oh, I think that here's your problem. It wasn't a technical skill. It was the genius part of it.
Right. They didn't bring her in and say, well, she knows a lot about that field, wherever it is. They actually had no idea which field to look in. She could look across the whole thing and go, I think it's over there. And that's, again, it's not magic. It's a skill set where people just see patterns that other people don't see.
Mm-hmm.
And so without D on a team, without discernment, that can be a problem. Now, without G, I can talk about a lot. Cody, you and I have a great story here, and that is companies that don't have G. I was just talking to somebody last week about this. They have a lot of good ideas, and they don't have as much enthusiasm. I was talking to a guy who runs content for this amazing theological organization in Denver called the Augustine Institute. And they were talking about when there's no G on a team, people are like, how come people aren't more excited about our products internally? And he goes, we didn't have G on our team. There was nobody galvanizing, because when you have a galvanizer, they're like, this is great. Everybody come in here. Let's talk about this.
Yep.
And it was so great to talk to him about the absence of G. And the problem is, if somebody then slides into and starts G'ing, even though they don't like to, and this is what I did for about 24 and a half years, it starts to burn them out, and they start to resent the fact that they're going to have to bang their head on a wall to get a new product going. So this is what happened at the table group. I couldn't figure out why I was grumpy all the time. I would come to work ready to do invention and discernment, and I'd walk in the door with a smile on my face, and people would go, you need to push us on this, or I don't think they're doing that, or I don't know if we should do this anymore. And instead of me realizing, I'm just not good at this, I would galvanize and galvanize and galvanize, and I would start to get a little pissed off about it. And finally, I figured out I'm doing what I'm not meant to do. Cody, we looked at you're a working genius, and you were like, I love galvanizing. And I'm like, you're kidding. So we said, you're the CGO, the Chief Galvanizing Officer. And suddenly, here's the key. Our productivity went through the roof. Mm-hmm. I was doing more of what I'm meant to do. You were doing more of what you were meant to do. Everybody at the company, it just filled a gap that we had. And we produced more in the following 2 years than we had in the previous 10.
I believe that's true.
I think an important part of that story is the fact that, Pat, you had G in your working competency, and every single one of us had G in our working frustration. So if you looked at our team map, it was so crystal clear. Like, this is our problem. Right. We're relying on Pat's competency, and the rest of us hate to galvanize. That's a little plug for our team map there.
Yeah, and when you look at the T map, you're like, holy Toledo, no wonder. And the same thing for you is like, you had T, nobody else did. Well, let's let Tracy do all the tenacity work. And it was like, we're killing her. What's really interesting about that is it's not that you're doing something you don't like. Because you know what I found? This is fascinating on a team, and people can probably relate to this. People were actually, because they knew I was doing things outside of my area, they were, before we knew what it was, they just said, okay, you have to do this. They were taking things off my schedule that I loved doing in order to free up my time to do more of what I didn't like doing. Yeah. And they were doing that like, well, we want you to relax more. And it was like, oh, so you're going to take away my joy. We didn't know that at the time, but after we came up with the model, I was like, oh, we keep taking all the invention and discernment off my calendar so I can do more galvanizing and tenacity. That's a bummer.
And that actually speaks to, I love this analogy because one of our master facilitators uses this as well. It's like, your working genius is like getting your battery plugged in. It fills you up. It's not like, this is a neutral state. This is like, hey, when you're burned out, here's what you should do. Not do nothing, do something, and let that something be your genius. And so Pat's over here working in his working competency, watching his battery go down, down, down. And then out of good nature, our team is trying to say, well, let's not make him write that thing today because he's already pretty tired. When in fact, the very thing he would need is to go use some invention that would fill him up and bring him joy. It's amazing.
I remember people would go, hey, Pat, why don't you just take the rest of the day off? Just go home and rest. Because they thought that, and I was like, I would rather you give me something to do that would be fun for me. Now, I'd love to be with my family, unless, of course, I had to go home and G things there and T things there. But I love what you said there. Plug in and recharge by doing what you love. Doing nothing is not necessarily going to recharge you. In fact, it often doesn't.
Yep.
Okay. Now, what about teams that don't have E, enablement? Okay, this is huge. And I was talking to those guys out in Denver about this as well. And because there's still people that go, enablement doesn't sound like a genius. It's like such an important genius. When there is nobody on a team that responds to the call for action, that says, I'm excited because you are, and I'm going to figure out what's necessary, things just don't go forward. And people say, how come we were so excited, but nothing is moving forward? And it's because if there is nobody that says, I will come alongside and do what's necessary to get this off the ground, and this is such a genius, and I really wish and hope and pray that anyone who has enablement as a genius does not diminish it, because every team needs it. They are often, in many ways, the most important team players, because when that's not there, nothing moves forward.
Yeah.
And so when you don't have it, oftentimes morale is really low, progress slows down, and everybody is like inexplicably frustrated that all their best ideas that people were once so excited about aren't moving forward.
Well, I love that description. I've noticed something else recently on teams that lack E. And I think it's like, so think of a team map where they're fully represented in everything but E. So you go from WID to G and T. And what it feels like is happening there is that is just a siloed organization that gets results. Everyone is working more in silos. And I think the E part of this, because if you think about what gives joy and energy to a tenacity person, which we'll talk about next, the E actually is about the person, where tenacity is about the result. Yeah. And so it is that camaraderie, that glue on the team that holds it together. So there's plenty of organizations that still get things done, but the way they go about getting things done is it's not enjoyable. It's just task oriented and sort of sterile, rather than, boy, I'm coming alongside. I anticipate your needs. That's why I love when you call them ideal team players, because it really is sort of the glue on a team.
Yeah. You know, my friend Tim, who I was talking to this week in Denver, one of his executives has E, and the guy said to me, the executive, he said, you know, I'm a WE. Is that a leadership type? And I quoted you, Cody. I said, well, what Cody likes to say is the only thing that matters is that you're self-aware, and because every type is a leader. But what I heard from these guys, Tim told me, he goes, this guy Ben, who works for me, who's an E, when he says we really should celebrate people's birthdays, we should get together and go to lunch or do something else. And Tim is like, really? That sounds like something from The Office, whatever else. And then he goes, but then they do it. And he goes, that's how I get to know people. That's how we gel as a team. That's the glue that comes together. And we learn about what's going on in our lives. But sometimes it takes an E to say, we need to do that. I feel the need to respond to the needs of the people in the organization. And like Tim said, I love that guy making me do that, because I wouldn't think of that on my own. And it's not just something nice. It's something that's required in every organization. So let's stop denigrating ourselves, E's. I don't have any of it. So doing it.
I think this is why you and I we're like overly emphatic about the value of E, is because you and I have said this. Our team members might disagree with this. They think T is our lowest, that we can't use tenacity. But really, I think both of our lowest is E, enablement, in the sense that, like, I just don't want to help other people. Like, I don't want to, and it's not that, but it's
no. We don't want to help other people on their terms.
Totally.
If it doesn't coincide with our genius.
Yes.
If a stranger walked up to me or sitting next to me on an airplane, this happens all the time, and said, gee, I need some advice, or I need a new idea. Oh my gosh, I'd probably follow them home and spend 2 weeks helping them.
Yep.
But if they said, would you help me do something that you're not good at, but I just need it to be done? It's like, oh, that's going to crush me. Like when people say, we're going to go build homes. We went twice, Cody, and built homes in Mexico as a family. I didn't want to go because I'm crappy at building homes and I don't follow rules and measure things. Right. I should be next to them, talking to the kids in the family and playing games with them and giving them ideas about careers they can do. But I had to sit there for 3 days. It was good for me, and follow instructions and do what the guy told me. Now, let me tell you, I was probably the least productive of all the workers.
Yeah.
But so it depends. We do love to help people, but on our terms, which I feel ashamed to admit.
I'm fine outing myself. We outed Tracy earlier, so we can just do it ourselves here.
Very good. What about teams that lack tenacity? They lack the T. Well, what you have a great saying about this, Cody.
You don't hear about them because they didn't finish that product or actually actualize their business. So they so much lack the ability to push things through to the finish line that you didn't hear about them. They're not in the news. They don't have a building. They don't have a hiring process. They never finished any of those things.
There's a lot of startups that have tons of WID, all of them, but no T.
Mm-hmm.
And they just never make it. And people go, well, their idea must not have been good enough. And it's like, no, you're analyzing the decision science, not the implementation science. The problem is they just couldn't work through it. And that's why I was with a relatively young company doing theirs. And I looked at and in fact, I had 60 minutes to go soup to nuts with this team. It was as a favor for a guy. And so all I said is, fill out the thing. I want to look at your genius map, your team map. And I saw there was one woman in this young company that had 15 employees, and one woman had T. Nobody else did. I didn't know who she was. She was on a Zoom screen. And I just said, who's Marion? Is she burning out? And are you guys worried that she's going to quit? And they just started laughing. And they said, how did you know? This is one of those magic moments. I said, because my guess is that you guys go to her and go, will you finish this? And she says, yeah, I'll do it. And she's getting crushed. And they said, that's exactly what's happening. Because that company won't survive if Marion doesn't do all the work taking it across the finish line. And Marion's going to die before they get the whole company across the finish line.
And oftentimes, I mean, that's the part that takes the most time in companies. You can wonder for 5 minutes and come up with the right problem. It takes, and when you get to T, I mean, the reason she's crushed is because everyone is relying on her to do that across all these ideas and initiatives. What's interesting too is that I was talking with a 3-person company or a 2-person company at that point, and they had a great idea, and both of the founders of this company were in the first 3 geniuses. You know, WI or G was the lowest they went on that widget, and I was like, hey, you guys have a really great idea. And if you don't hire someone or outsource all of the tenacity work, it will never come to fruition, you know, and because you're naturally not going to do it, or you'll grit your teeth and you'll try to do the tenacity thing, even though it's your frustration. And by the time you get it done, you're going to be resentful that you even had to do this. It's going to burn you out. You're not even going to want this business.
You know, I bet deep down inside, they knew it.
Yeah.
And I bet they were relieved to know that they needed to find an external solution rather than, because they were probably looking at the other guy going, I hope he does it. I hope she does it.
Totally.
All right. I think that's what's the thing. Every single one of these is necessary. And by the way, we go through all this in the book that's coming out in September, the 6 types of working genius. I wish it were coming out now, but there's a shortage of trees and paper. But it's coming September. If you want to go on and pre-purchase that book, we would love that. You'll get it the day it comes out. You can go to Barnes & Noble or Amazon or anywhere books are sold and pre-purchase that. The 6 types of working genius. There's a great fable in there. I've been told it's great. I love writing fables, but I've read it 35 times now, so I really have no ability to evaluate it. But
it's great, Pat. I can attest to that.
I was going to say, this is a perfect example of not relying on your competency of galvanizing, because you're a crap galvanizer when it comes to your own book, which is, this book is great. And all the listeners who've been getting this content from us, the story is fantastic. There's way more content in the back of that book for people to enjoy. And if you've loved this, there's, tens of thousands of people that have listened to this podcast since we started it. If you've loved it, that would be a huge gift to us if you would go out and pre-order that book. There you go, Pat. I won't make you talk about your own book. I'll galvanize.
By the way, I would have never done that, but Matt put up on my screen here a note. Yeah. He said, hey, you need to promote the book. And I was like, okay. By the way, here's a hilarious story. I know this is long, but one of Matt's friends asked him what he did for a living, and he was talking about the book, and he goes, so you actually read that book before it comes out? And Matt said, are you kidding? I read it 30 times. He has nightmares about that book, because we all at the table group read it and provide editing and stuff, which I appreciate so much.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the end of today's podcast. Hey, if you like this, send it to you. Tell a friend about it, because so many people are getting a lot of relief from understanding their genius. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you next time on the Working Genius Podcast. God bless.